Imagine, if you dare, the furious, unbridled rage of the Parisian mob. Not merely the jubilation of triumph, but the very rending of human flesh from remains. Concino Concini, the man who effectively ruled France from the shadows, was dead, shot on the king's orders. But death for him was merely a prelude to an inferno of popular vengeance that defied comprehension. His corpse, a grotesque puppet, became the final canvas for a nation's accumulated fury. It was not enough that he lay lifeless. The crowd, a seething maelstrom of primal revulsion, dragged his body through the cobblestone streets. His head, severed, was displayed on a pike, his limbs torn apart for macabre souvenirs. Stories, whispered then and echoing now, speak of pieces of his flesh being sold and even consumed by a populace driven to a macabre frenzy. This was not justice. It was an exorcism. A visceral, abhorrent act, in various ways. For too long, Concini had been a symbol of everything that was wrong with the kingdom. Foreign influence, corruption, the perceived weakness of the queen regent, the humiliation of the sidelined young king. His downfall, orchestrated by a desperate young monarch yearning to reclaim his throne, was not merely a political assassination. It was a public ritual of purification. The roar of the crowd, the blood on the stones, the dismembered body. These were not just echoes of death, but a visceral manifestation of deep societal trauma, a collective scream against the perceived tyranny of a foreign upstart. The king's order merely opened the floodgates to an ocean of accumulated resentment. Such an end, so utterly devoid of dignity, so steeped in the darkest corners of human hatred, compels one to ask a profound question. Who was this man, Concino Concini? What forces, what ambitions, what hidden wounds forged a character capable of inspiring such adoration and such ultimate, horrifying hatred? To truly comprehend the horror of his demise, to grasp the grotesque spectacle of his final moments, the primal, visceral rage that tore his body apart on the cobblestone streets of Paris, we must first unearth the winding roots of his ascent, delve into the murky depths of his genesis. Who was Concino Concini before he became the symbol of all that France despised? He was a being forged in the crucible of Florentine ambition, a man whose very DNA seemed encoded with a ruthless drive for elevation, for dominance, to leave an indelible, though often blood-soaked, mark on history. Born into a minor, yet proud Florentine noble family, Concini inherited little but a name and a burning sense of inadequacy. Florence, the shining heart of the Renaissance, was paradoxically also a hornet's nest of intrigue, a city where beauty masked a brutal pragmatism. Here, power was not simply inherited. It was a brutal contest, a game of shadows and whispers, where the Medici, those grand architects of cunning, had perfected the art of veiled tyranny and influence peddling. This was the air Concini breathed, the unspoken curriculum he absorbed. True power lay not in ancient lineage, but in the audacious courage to seize it, to bend reality to one's will, to outwit and outmaneuver. The very stones of Florence whispered tales of ambition, of families rising and falling on waves of deception and strategic alliances. Concini was a product of this ruthless school, a student of its unspoken rules, where trust was a luxury and self-preservation the ultimate virtue. His early life was a crucible of perceived slights, a constant gnawing awareness of his peripheral status. He was an outsider in a world of established grandeur, a minor player in a game dominated by ancient bloodlines. This was not merely ambition. It was a hungry, almost pathological need to prove his worth, to silence the whispers of his insignificance, to forge a destiny that defied his humble origins. Every grievance, real or imagined, became fuel for an internal inferno, an insatiable thirst for recognition and control. Imagine a boy watching from the sidelines, absorbing the lessons of power and privilege he was denied, building a mental blueprint for his own ascent. It wasn't about wealth for wealth's sake. It was about the power wealth bought, the respect it commanded, the fear it instilled. It was about escaping the suffocating anonymity of his past, about etching his name, however controversial, into the annals of power. And then, fate, or perhaps a meticulously crafted plan, presented him with Leonora, not merely a woman, but a cosmic convergence, a fateful alignment of stars that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of his life, and indeed, the very fabric of France. Leonora, a Florentine herself, was no ordinary lady-in-waiting. She was a shadow, a confidant, the ever-watchful eye of Marie de Medici. Their bond was symbiotic, almost pathologically intertwined, born of a shared foreignness within the Parisian court that viewed them both with suspicion. Leonora possessed an uncanny ability to read Marie, to anticipate her desires, to soothe her anxieties, and crucially, to subtly guide her thoughts, becoming Marie's emotional anchor in an alien, often hostile court. She understood Marie's insecurities, her craving for loyalty, her susceptibility to flattery. A psychological map that Concini would exploit with brutal efficiency. Concini, with an almost predatory instinct, recognized this unique, invaluable asset. Was their initial connection true affection, or a cold, calculated exchange of ambitions? The truth, perhaps, is a murky blend of both, for in the ruthless pursuit of power, love often becomes a convenient mask, a potent tool, a binding compact of mutual benefit. Leonora, herself an outsider, a woman of sharp intellect and even sharper ambition, found in Concini a mirror to her own desires for elevation. Together they forged an unholy alliance, a silent pact sealed not by rings, but by shared dreams of boundless domination. Their relationship transcended mere romance. It was a strategic partnership, a two-headed hydra poised to devour the heart of the French state. She became his eyes and ears in the Queen's most private chambers, his whisper in Marie's ear, his unseen hand manipulating royal puppets. Through Leonora, Concini gained not just access, but an insidious intimacy with power. He didn't just meet Marie. He penetrated her psyche, becoming an indispensable, almost addictive part of her world, a trusted voice in a country that viewed him with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. This was his point of no return. Once he tasted this intoxicating proximity to absolute power, once he understood the intricate mechanisms of influence through the Queen, there was no turning back. The insignificant Florentine noble was now a shadow player on Europe's grandest stage, his very existence a quiet, growing cancer within the French body politic, poised to metastasize. The stage was set for a power grab of unprecedented audacity. The key to the Queen's ear was firmly in his grasp. The psychological levers of influence were understood and mastered. But the true scale of his ambition, the breathtaking ruthlessness of his ascent, the systematic dismantling of French power structures, the brazen accumulation of wealth and titles, this was merely the overture. The symphony of his rule, a cacophony of corruption and scandalous accumulation, was about to begin. Imagine a man born into a world where his name meant absolutely nothing, suddenly holding the reins of Europe's most powerful kingdom. Not just holding them, but choking them, twisting them inside out at his whim. This was Concino Concini at the zenith of his audacious power. A power so absolute, so arrogant, that it seemed almost mystical, as if the devil himself whispered the formulas of a coup d'etat until he, this Florentine upstart, became a shadow king whose name was whispered with hatred and fear in every corner of France. He was not merely a favorite. He was a parasite, grown to proportions that threatened the very body of the state. He was the embodiment of everything old France despised, a foreigner, devoid of noble blood, yet possessing boundless greed and unscrupulousness that elevated him to a peak from which he looked down on everyone with contempt, as if they were insignificant insects. His first, most audacious act, a true declaration of war on the old order, was the systematic dismantling of Maximilien de Béthune, Duke of Sully. Sully was not just the finance minister. He was a living monument to the era of Henry IV, a symbol of stability, order, and, crucially, the late king's legacy. His treasury, filled with the blood and sweat of the French people, was not just a repository of gold, but a metaphor for France's sovereignty, its independence, its economic might. And Concini, this foreign Florentine, brazenly and unceremoniously plunged his predatory hands into it. He didn't just seize the treasury, he eviscerated it, like a surgeon removing the heart of the old monarchy to replace it with his own, foreign rhythm. This was not an act of simple greed, though greed was his essence. It was an act of power, a declaration that from now on, France's financial arteries pulsed to the beat of his own ambitions. Every golden écu extracted from Sully's coffers was not just a coin, but a brick in the foundation of his personal empire, a signal to the aristocracy. Your old gods are dead. I am your new god, or your curse. He didn't just dismiss Sully. He publicly humiliated him, kicking him out of government like an annoying lackey, thereby sending a clear message. No one was safe. No one was inviolable, if they stood in Concini's way. But his insatiability knew no bounds. He was like a cancer, metastasizing throughout the body of France. Titles, lands, offices. Concini devoured them with the same feverish greed with which a feverish patient gasps for air. He became a marshal of France, though he had never commanded a single battle. He became governor of Amiens, Normandy, Picardy, regions he had barely seen, but which now fed his untold riches. Each new title was not just an honorific, but another thread in the web he wove around France, another tentacle digging into its living flesh. He didn't buy them. He wrung them out, using the Queen Regent as his personal battering ram, as a blind instrument of his will. Imagine the scene. Marie de Medici, blinded by his charm, his manipulations, and perhaps simply weary of the burden of power, blindly signing one decree after another, transferring what did not belong to her. Sovereignty over entire provinces, command over armies, the right to judge life and death. This was not merely corruption. It was institutionalized usurpation, where one man's personal whim became law for an entire kingdom, and his greed, state policy. His wealth grew by the hour, and every louis d'or he acquired was not just a coin, but a slap in the face to every impoverished peasant, every ruined noble, every soldier dying for France, while this upstart feasted on their bones. But his true mastery, his most diabolical game, lay in the unprecedented manipulation of the French aristocracy. He did not seek to win them over. He sought to break them, to turn them into his puppets, or at worst, into vanquished enemies. He pitted them against each other, setting ancient clans at odds, promising favors to those who groveled, and ruthlessly destroying those who dared to resist. He turned the royal court into a freak show, where every noble dignitary, once proud of their lineage and influence, was forced to bow before this Florentine upstart, whose hands were soiled with intrigue and whose name evoked disgust. He took their lands, their offices, their honor, reveling in their humiliation, like a vampire revels in blood. He publicly humiliated duke after duke, prince after prince, making a mockery of them, stripping them of their dignity before the entire court. His arrogance was so boundless that it transcended common sense. He didn't just think he was above everyone. He acted as if he was the only one with the right to breathe the air of France, as if France were his personal fiefdom. He laughed at their traditions, their pride, their faith, their centuries of history. He was a foreign body that was not merely rejected by the organism, but actively consumed it, causing gangrene in the very heart of the French state, threatening to destroy it from within. At the peak of his power, Concini was blinded by his own brilliance, his own monstrous strength. He committed the classic, fatal error of all tyrants. He believed in his invulnerability, in his godlike status. His insolence reached its zenith. He openly mocked the young King Louis XIII, effectively holding him in a gilded cage, stripping him not only of power, but of basic human dignity. He didn't merely ignore the whispers of conspiracies. He openly scorned his enemies, considering them too insignificant to pose a threat. He didn't see, or refused to see, the growl of discontent that grew in every corner of France, from the Parisian slums to the most distant provinces. He saw himself as a weaver of destinies, not a target. His arrogance was so overwhelming that it became his shield and his curse simultaneously. It created around him an impenetrable cocoon of illusion, within which he was omnipotent, and outside, detested by all. He could not imagine that the system he had so meticulously built could collapse. He was certain that his connection with Marie de Medici was an unbreakable chain binding him to the throne, his personal shield against all ills. He did not understand that even the strongest chains can break when the burden becomes unbearable, when the accumulated tension reaches a critical point. And that point was approaching, unseen by his power-addled gaze. Behind his back, in the shadows of the palace, forces matured whose patience was exhausted, whose hatred was as deep as his ambition, and whose motives were far more complex than a mere desire for power, touching upon honor, blood, and the very soul of France. His towering edifice of power, built on the shifting sands of royal favor and popular contempt, seemed impregnable. And yet, beneath its gilded facade, an intricate web of grievances, ambitions, and desperate hopes relentlessly tightened around Concino Concini. To understand his dramatic fall, we must first identify the hidden architects of his downfall, the players whose motives, both primal and pragmatic, converged into a lethal current. At the heart of Concini's seemingly untouchable position lay the enigmatic, almost pathological devotion of Queen Marie de Medici. Why such unwavering loyalty to a man who, by all accounts, was a corrupt, arrogant upstart? It was not simply a capricious whim of the queen. Marie, a Florentine herself, an outsider in the viper's nest of the French court, found in Concini and his wife, Leonora, not just loyal servants, but a reflection of her own displaced identity. They were her own in a foreign land, her direct connection to a past she perhaps secretly longed for. More importantly, they were her instruments of control. Through them, she could assert her will, punish enemies, and govern a kingdom she never fully understood. Concini's ruthless efficiency in dismantling the old guard, in subduing the proud French aristocracy, served Marie's deeply rooted need for absolute, unchallenged power. He was her shield, her sword, and her mirror, reflecting the power she craved, but was perhaps too insecure to wield directly. Their bond was a toxic symbiosis, a shared exile from traditional power norms, bound by mutual dependence and a shared contempt for the established order. But this shared contempt was a double-edged sword. Every confiscated estate, every exiled noble, every public humiliation Concini inflicted upon France's ancient families etched itself deeply into the collective memory of the aristocracy. To them, Concini was not merely a corrupt administrator. He was an existential threat. He represented the ultimate transgression, a commoner, a foreigner, who dared to usurp their birthright, to trample centuries of lineage and honor. Proud dukes and princes, heirs to the very foundations of France, saw their power, their prestige, their very identity systematically eroded. Their outrage was not merely political. It was an instinctive, aristocratic fury, a burning desire to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They whispered in shaded salons, their indignation a slowly smoldering fuse, awaiting the spark that would ignite a devastating explosion. Beyond the gilded cages of the court, the festering pus of popular hatred festered. The Parisian populace, long accustomed to the theater of power, watched with escalating horror and disgust as Concini's opulence grew inversely to their suffering. His insatiable greed translated into onerous taxes, pervasive corruption, and a sense of profound injustice permeating all layers of society. He was not just a symbol of royal mismanagement. He was the face of their suffering, the living embodiment of a system that relentlessly exploited them. In the public squares, whispers, then murmurs, then outright condemnations rose. Their hatred was raw, primal, born of hunger and humiliation, demanding retribution. They yearned for a spectacle, a public purging that would rid the kingdom of this Italian blight. And then there was the young king, Louis XIII, a figure often overshadowed, but perhaps the most dangerous of all Concini's adversaries. For years he had been a phantom monarch, a royal prisoner in his own palace. His mother, the Queen Regent, treated him with contemptuous condescension, while Concini, the upstart, openly mocked his authority, flaunting his power as the true ruler of France. Imagine the slow burn of humiliation in a young, introverted, yet fiercely proud soul. A boy born to rule, forced to watch a foreign upstart usurp his throne, his voice, his very destiny. His silence was not weakness. It was the chilling calm before the storm. Beneath the quiet facade, a deeply rooted resentment matured, fueled by a desperate yearning for control, for recognition, for his rightful place. His psychological journey from neglected child to resolute avenger is one of the most compelling and terrifying transformations in French history. Into this explosive mixture stepped Armand Jean du Plessis, Bishop of Lausanne, soon to be Cardinal Richelieu. Not yet the all-powerful architect of French absolutism, but already a man of formidable intellect and ruthless ambition. Richelieu, with his keen political acumen, saw Concini not merely as a rival, but as a cancerous growth on the political body of France. He understood that Concini's chaotic rule, His systematic weakening of the aristocracy and his alienation of the populace were destabilizing the very foundations of the state. For Richelieu, the path to a strong, unified France lay through a strong, undisputed monarch. Concini was an obstacle to this grand design, a temporary destructive anomaly that needed to be removed. He recognized the king's smoldering rage, the nobility's seething resentment, and the populace's hunger. He possessed the strategic genius to harness these disparate forces, to orchestrate the inevitable clash. The stage was set not for a simple political coup, but for a meticulously planned, almost theatrical execution, designed to send an unambiguous message to all who dared challenge the true power of the crown. The currents of hatred and ambition converged, and the silent king, long a mere puppet, began to pull his own strings, preparing for a final decisive act that would shake the very foundations of the Louvre and plunge Paris into a frenzy of blood and retribution. The air of Paris, usually thick with the stench of poverty and whispers of discontent, now pulsed with an unseen current of something far more volatile. A storm was brewing not in the heavens, but within the gilded cages of the Louvre. For months, the young King Louis XIII, little more than a puppet in his own court, boiled in a cauldron of humiliation and impotent fury. His mother, Marie de Medici, blinded by her pathological dependence and insatiable thirst for control, had allowed Concini not just to usurp the throne, but to openly mock the very idea of royal authority. This was no longer merely a personal challenge. It was an existential threat to the crown, to France itself. The conspiracy was born in the shadows, nurtured by the desperation of a king with nothing left to lose but his own soul. Charles d'Albert, Duc de Luynes, a shrewd and ambitious courtier, became the king's confidant, his shadow, the architect of a plot so audacious, so utterly ruthless, that it would forever alter the course of French history. They understood that Concini, bloated with power and reeking of arrogance, would never willingly relinquish his grip. He had to be removed, like a cancerous growth, and the removal had to be sudden, decisive, and public. The chosen instrument of this royal operation was Nicolas de Vitry, captain of the Royal Guard, a man whose loyalty had been meticulously cultivated, whose ambitions were carefully aligned with the king's desperate need for liberation. The morning of April 24, 1617 dawned like any other, deceptively calm. Concini, Marshal d'Ancre, rode towards the Louvre, his retinue a glittering testament to his ill-gotten power. He was a man utterly convinced of his invincibility, strutting through the world as if it were his personal stage, the king merely a supporting actor in his grand drama. He approached the drawbridge, the very threshold of royal power, a place where for years he had entered and exited with the insolence of a true sovereign. This was the scene for the final act, a grim spectacle, designed not merely to kill a man, but to shatter a myth. As Concini stepped onto the bridge, the heavy chains behind him clanked, and a chilling silence fell. Then, from beneath the archway, Vitry emerged, his face a mask of grim determination. "Monsieur le Maréchal," he intoned, his voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade. "I arrest you by order of the king." Concini, startled but still arrogant, reached for his sword. A fatal mistake. Before his hand could grasp the hilt, the air exploded with the crack of muskets. 3 shots, fired at point-blank range, ripped through his chest. He collapsed, his silk garments stained crimson. His reign ended not with a whimper, but with a sudden, brutal bang. His body, still twitching, was quickly finished off with daggers, a final, visceral affirmation of the king's newfound bloody authority. The message was clear. No one, not even an all-powerful favorite, was beyond the reach of the true sovereign. News swept through the Louvre like wildfire, reaching Marie de Medici in her private chambers. The shock was instantaneous, paralyzing. Her beloved Concini, her anchor, her puppet master, was dead. Her reaction was a grotesque tapestry of grief, rage, and dawning horror. She screamed, she wept, she cursed. But beneath the hysteria lay a chilling realization. Her power, the very foundation of her existence, had been ripped away in an instant. Her son, whom she had scorned and marginalized, had finally asserted himself in the most brutal, unambiguous way. She was no longer the regent, no longer the queen who pulled the strings. She was a humiliated mother, confined to her chambers, stripped of influence, a prisoner in her own palace. The silence of the court, once filled with her decrees and Concini's pronouncements, now echoed with her own defeat. But outside the Louvre, the silence was broken by another sound, a roar. The news of Concini's death spread through Paris with the speed of a plague, but unlike a plague, it brought not fear, but a surge of delirious joy. The bells of Notre Dame began to peal, not in mourning, but in jubilant celebration. Bonfires were lit in the streets, wine flowed freely, and the long-suffering populace poured from their hovels, their faces alight with terrifying, cathartic joy. This was not merely the death of a man. It was a symbolic execution of an entire era of corruption, foreign domination, and crushing taxation. The crowd, a primal force unleashed, descended upon Concini's lifeless body. What followed was a terrifying spectacle of primal vengeance, a dark carnival of desecration. His corpse, initially left on the bridge, was seized, dragged through the muddy streets like a rag doll, beaten and spat upon. The spectacle of pure barbarity was captivating. They tore off his clothes, exposing his flesh to the jeering crowd. His head, the very seat of his arrogant intellect, was brutally severed, impaled on a pike, and paraded through the city, a grotesque trophy of popular justice. His limbs were torn from his torso, dismembered, and sold as gruesome souvenirs. Pieces of his flesh, legend has it, were even consumed by the most fervent, perhaps the most deranged, members of the mob, a symbolic act of devouring the tyrant, absorbing his power, or simply expelling the poison he represented. This was not merely hatred. It was a ritualistic purification, an exorcism of an unclean spirit from the national soul. The streets ran red not only with Concini's blood, but with the accumulated fury of a nation finally breaking its chains. Concini's brutal end was more than just a political assassination. It was a seismic event that shook the very foundations of the French monarchy. It was a harsh, bloody lesson in the perils of unchecked ambition, the fragility of power built on favoritism, and the terrifying, unpredictable force of a populace pushed to its breaking point. But was it merely the end of one man, or the beginning of a new, equally complex chapter in the dark annals of power? The echoes of that day still whisper through the corridors of history, inviting us to ponder the enduring patterns of control, corruption, and the perennial struggle for dominance. What, ultimately, did the blood-soaked saga of Concino Concini teach us? Beyond the gruesome spectacle of his demise, beyond the chilling psychological portraits of the queen, the king, and the courtier, lies a mirror reflecting the eternal pathologies of power. His ascent was a cruel masterclass in parasitic ambition, how to leech onto the very heart of power, drain it, and redirect its lifeblood into one's own veins. Concini proved that a leadership vacuum, coupled with the queen's psychological vulnerability and the young king's impotence, creates fertile ground for the most audacious usurpers. He showed us the terrifying fragility of an established order when confronted by a will utterly devoid of scruples, driven by an insatiable hunger to transcend its own perceived insignificance. His contempt for the old guard, his systematic dismantling of aristocratic privileges, his audacious accumulation of wealth and titles, these were textbook moves for an outsider building an empire from within. But this empire, built on sand and resentment, was always destined to crumble under the weight of its own hubris. The lesson is stark. Power seized through manipulation and wielded with unrestrained arrogance sows the seeds of its own violent destruction. The silence of the oppressed is not consent. It is a gathering storm. And what of today? Are we so naive as to believe that the Concini phenomenon remains confined to the dusty pages of history? Look closer. The echoes are deafening. How many unelected advisors, how many shadow figures within the inner circles of power operate with astonishing influence, shaping policy, accumulating wealth, and pulling strings, often with less accountability than a medieval monarch? The phenomenon of favoritism, where personal loyalty eclipses merit and public